Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. So I'm Brian Miller. I'm the director of the Eoin McKiernan Library, and I'm just kind of self-introducing today, but housekeeping, we are online. This is a webinar, so welcome to anybody that's joining online. And then we're in person here at the Health Protection Arts Center, the beautiful classroom across the hall from the Eoin McKiernan Library. And today, so for the people that are in the room, there's no way to get rid of my head being on this side of the screen. We can move my head and it doesn't hurt me at all. And but we did one of these yesterday and the speaker's head was there, and so I went and moved all the pictures over in my slides this morning to try to keep my head off top of them. So hopefully it all works out okay. But we did manage to clean up the rest of the screen. We learned that if you touch it, watch, is it going to actually work now? Oh, before it worked, oh, there. I think, yeah, there we go. So hopefully it's workable. It allows us to be broadcasting this online to people that can't be here in person. So today's talk is called New Deals and 8-Hand Reels, and it's about Irish music, dance, and culture in the Depression era Twin Cities. And that was my valiant attempt at a clever title that sort of drew together what I want to talk about today. But it all comes back to this photo, really. And for those that are in the room, I printed out a copy of it over there at the side of the room. So last year, I gave a talk and wrote up an article on the Twin City Irish American Club that was active here, started in 1948 and went really strong through the 50s and to some extent through the 60s, and then kind of dropped off a little bit. But it was kind of an amazing cultural organization here in the Twin Cities, and there are still a number of people that were involved in that Twin City Irish American Club that are around town. We lost one of our kind of elder statesman of the music community last year, Martin McHugh, and he was a big part of that club. And so he came in and played last year when we did the talk, and it was really a special thing. But along the course of doing the research for that talk, there were hints at things that came before, and I think that's the beauty of historical research, is there's always a new thread, you know, and you get obsessed about the new thing. And one of the families that I met with as part of that process for the last year's talk was the Moran McDonough family. Their mom, Margaret Sis McDonough, was super active in Irish cultural organizations going way back, and I didn't even know, when I met with them, I figured they would know a lot about the Irish American Club. But then they had this photo, and they said, "Oh yeah, that's mom in the 30s." 30s, that's crazy. So, and the only people they were able to identify in the photo are so Margaret McDonough, her nickname was Sis. Sis McDonough is the third from the right there. And then the woman peeking her head up over the other shoulder of the fiddle player was her cousin, Veronica, who everybody called Ronnie. So Ronnie, that's Ronnie Goodman and Sis McDonough. And that's what we knew at that time. Kind of around, I think maybe at the day that I gave the talk, one of the people that remembered some of these folks stood up and said, "That's Johnny Malone next to Ronnie Goodman." So kind of the guy with the wonderfully short tie there is Johnny Malone. He's related to, if people know Mark Malone, that's still involved in the community. Johnny was, I think, an uncle to Mark's dad, and the Malones had a lot of connections to McDonough's. I'm going to talk also about some information I got from Marty McHugh. So that's Marty there, that passed away sadly last fall, but was a big part of the Irish American Club. And we found out kind of through doing the research that he arrived in Minnesota in 1949, which was earlier than any of us thought, or earlier than he ever admitted that he came over. So he really was this incredible link over this insane amount of time, like 70 years of Irish music and Irish culture in the Twin Cities. And so, and there's the Morans there. So that's Sis's husband, Vince Morin, who actually passed away not too long after I interviewed him for the Irish American Club talk. And then those are two of their sons, Paul and Tim. But when Marty McHugh did an oral history interview with Dahi Sproul, he also hinted at things that came before him. So this is a little clip of that interview where he's talking about a fiddle player named Mike Sullivan.
Dahi, there was a fine fiddle player here, his name was Mike Sullivan.
Yeah.
And him and his daughter, they used to run dances on their own.
Huh. Yeah.
But that's somebody else playing with them. There was the three of them.
Yeah.
And they used to have dances, you know, where United Bank is over there in Snelling and Selby.
Yeah.
There's a dance hall up there. I think it was called the Liberty Hall. And that's where the Irish used to go for years.
That was going when you first came?
Yeah, it was winding down when I came.
Was it? Yeah.
The Irish American Club had taken over.
I see. So this is probably the earliest venue that we can talk about then, this Liberty Hall.
Yeah, Liberty Hall.
Yeah.
So if you can hear me saying Liberty Hall at the corner of Selby and Snelling, where the Whole Foods is now, but for a long time it was a bank there. And I've found absolutely nothing mentioning a place called Liberty Hall. So that's still kind of a mystery hanging out there. But that's a picture of Martin not too long after he came over. So he came over in 49. He's saying this guy, Mike Sullivan, was the big fiddle player, the big musician in town before his time, and was maybe still around. You get the impression that he met him, and there were a couple other people that sort of remembered him. So of course the obvious question is that Mike Sullivan in the middle of the photo? And I asked Marty, and he just seemed confused by that photo. He was like, I don't know any of these people. He kind of knew Sis, but if you can imagine, I suppose, like I came to the Twin Cities from growing up in Bemidji in 1998. Somebody had shown me a picture of somebody from 1988, in 70 years. Who knows, so Marty wasn't sure if that was Mike Sullivan, but these were kind of the seeds basically to the project that I will be unfolding today. And one of the things that also came up when I did the research for the Irish American Club project was that the reason for that club and a lot of what was going on in the 50s was because there was a uptick in immigration after World War II, 48, 49, early 50s. There were quite a few Irish immigrants to Minnesota at that time. And, it was nothing like back in the 1800s, the numbers that were coming over then, but there was a little bubble then. And it's clear that there was very little immigration from the stock market crash through the 1930s and through World War II. So that makes the 1930s this kind of interesting time period to look at, because it's a time when there wasn't a lot of immigration. You kind of have to look back before it to see kind of what was there when the Depression came and who was there when the Depression came. And then those, one could assume are going to be kind of the main characters of the 1930s scene. And that kind of ends up being the case as far as I can tell. So, just to kind of give the backdrop here, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and there's a couple of Hibernians here in the house today. Thanks for coming, guys. But was established in Minnesota way back in 1879. And, it wasn't too long before there were divisions in both the Twin Cities, multiple divisions. It grew. There were quite a few divisions by the 19-teens, 20s. It was a happening organization. And here's a picture of a tug of war team from 1914. Then the Ladies Auxiliary of the AOH was established in 1894, and again, divisions on both sides. And if you're familiar with the Hibernians, which I'm only just slowly getting to understand the organization, and of course it's changed over time like everything else, but they worked together sometimes, the Ladies Auxiliary and the AOH, and sometimes they kind of did their own things. Same with the different divisions. You find some reports of like all the Hibernians in Ramsey County are doing X, Y, or Z, all the Hibernians in Hennepin County, or it's just one division, or it's this division and that division, so there were different kind of breakdowns with that. And then there were all these other clubs. There was a lot going on in the teens and 20s, so obviously that would be maybe a next topic to look at. But here in St. Paul, and of course, a lot of these clubs called themselves the Twin City something or other, but they were really based in one city or the other. This was the streetcars were in, and cars were becoming more available. There was some connection, but even these days, now I've lived in St. Paul for a while, I'm scared of crossing the river. There was a group called the Twin Cities Shamrock Social Club that was really a St. Paul-based group that went for a long time, started around 1913, and they used to have these riverboat cruises out on the Mississippi River with two different bands. Like this listing from 1917 says they have a Orenshaw's brass band upstairs, and then on the lower deck they have a celebrated Irish piper, which is really tantalizing. And I have a guess as to who that piper was, which I'll get to in a minute. The other side of the river, there was a group, confusingly also called the Twin City Irish American Club, but really no relationship to the one that came after World War II. And they also had, I don't know if they had any floating parties, but they had ones on dry land where there were two separate rooms, one for old time and one for modern dances in the 20s. And you start seeing, especially over in Minneapolis, you start seeing the same names in the Hibernians and in all these different clubs. So this guy like McConville, for instance, who was quite really early generation, and I think came from Antrim. He was a leader with the Twin City Irish American Club. He also was they needed like a guy from the AOH to found the Ladies Auxiliary. So he was like the founder of it. And then he went to the Ladies Auxiliary meetings for, even though there was all women and him. But, and then he was also state president of the next organization I'll mention. I'm just kind of mentioning these. I'm not going to give a big history or describe what they were. But the American Association for Recognition of the Irish Republic was actually an outfit that was founded by Eamon de Valera himself in 1920. And there was an active chapter of that over in Minneapolis. They even brought famous Countess Markowitz to Minnesota, and these other Irish political leaders in 1922. It's kind of amazing. And so these same guys, like this guy McConville, he was in all these different organizations, and a lot of the names from that era, they would have moved around. And then the last one, and these just the Minneapolis has digitized their newspapers, so it's quite easy, relatively speaking, to find things out about this era through newspapers.com and using the Minneapolis newspapers. But the 13th Ward, which is down, it's where the map is there by Benay-McCoska and down through Lake Harriet. And it's funny, this lake here was filled in with dirt from the airport, I understand. It's not a lake there anymore. But this woman, Mrs. Owen Cunningham, and her husband, Owen Cunningham, were both really active in the 13th Ward Shamrock Club. And the membership of that was almost identical to the people that were in the American Association for Recognition of the Irish Republic. And sometimes, in a very ink-intensive way, they're referred to as the 13th Ward Shamrock Club American Association for Recognition of the Irish Republic. But in the 1920s, there was still a lot of immigration. So a lot of, those clubs would have been generally started by older generation people that came over in the 1800s. But there was still immigrants coming over in the 1920s, including, this is sort of a random selection of guys, but the reason I have these faces is they're all people that were involved at some point with Irish clubs or music or dance or things in town. Edward Linehan from Down, he actually dove right in and was involved in things even in the 20s and stayed involved all the way up to the 60s. Another kind of real long-term guy. Paddy Hill came over in 23 and was really involved later, but I haven't found much about him in the 20s. Michael McNeve came from Mayo and went to Winnipeg first, where he was on the police force like in 1920, and then he came down to Twin Cities in 1923. He was also quite involved in the 20s. These other three guys, their names mostly come up later. Dominic Caulfield, his family got involved with the Festival of Nations kind of in the 40s, and he was recorded singing by Tom Dahill in the 70s, which is a kind of a future project they're working on. But he was here in the 20s, and then the Curtin brothers, who were later really involved in the scene, they also came right before the stock market crash. just to focus in on Michael, one of the guys there, Michael McNeeve, the one that came through Winnipeg, his granddaughter is Mary McNeeve, that was one of the leaders in Irish dance revival here in the 70s. And Mary did some oral history interviews. Her grandpa was gone, but about her grandpa with her parents and aunt and uncle in the 80s. And I thought it was interesting. Her mom, so Michael's daughter, Maureen, said she's talking about him coming over and what it was like to come over, you know, and be here during the 30s, kind of specifically. The people came over and they never looked back. At least my parents didn't. They had very few ties with Ireland once they were here. And my mother always said that she felt the reason a lot of them didn't go back was because it was a matter of pride. And if you came to this country, you were supposed to send money back. And if you didn't make it, you didn't have enough money to send back, you just didn't go and you didn't write, you know. And there's other historians of this time period that have said that because of the economy in the 30s, it really caused this big disconnect. And you could kind of assume maybe that was always the way it was, but I think if you look at, like, you know, the people that were in the De Valera's Association for Recognition of the Irish Republic, obviously they're looking back over the ocean, they're involved with the thinking about politics, things that are going on in Ireland. And, you know, people that were sending money, of course, they're thinking about their relatives and they're connected financially to things that are going on in Ireland. And that was less possible in the 30s. So that's just kind of something to say about the 30s, that there was this kind of break with connections to home, say. So, additional context, just to give like the historical, like what was going on in the 30s. Of course, people know the Great Depression and the stock market collapse, which happened in October 1929. The economy continued to tank, basically, I think bottomed out at 32, something like that. FDR took office in 33, started this barrage of different programs as an attempt to deal with the Depression, including the WPA, Works Progress Administration, which has some interesting connections to traditional music because they funded people that collected traditional music. They also funded some dance bands. Like in Duluth, there was a dance band that played jigs and reels that was funded by the WPA. It's kind of fascinating. But I didn't find that much about WPA funded activity in the Twin Cities. Here in Minnesota, we had a third party for most of the Depression that was in power in the governor's office and in a lot of state offices around the place. The Farmer Labor Party, which then later merged to become the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. The Irish, I haven't found lots of information about the Irish being very involved in the Farmer Labor Party. They were more likely to be in the Democratic Party. And a lot of the leaders, including the famous Farmer Labor governors, were of Scandinavian extraction. It was also an era where there was sort of parallels with today. There's kind of Elon Musk of the 1930s would have been Henry Ford, who's wildly famous and had a lot of wild opinions that he was also putting out there, and everybody had to deal with, just like we have to deal with what Elon thinks now. But he was really an influential guy. He really figures into today's story quite a bit. There was also this radio preacher, like a really powerful and popular populist, Father Coughlin, in Detroit, who was broadcast. He was kind of like, almost like, I don't know, the obvious comparison with like Rush Limbaugh. Like, he was really popular and really opinionated. He was a big fan of FDR at first, and then he turned hard against him, and he had some hardcore anti-Semitic beliefs that he was pushing on the radio as well. But he was wildly popular, so it's no doubt that a lot of the Irish in the Twin Cities would have been tuning into his show, at least to some point. Maybe he turned them off after a while, but I know Michael McNeeve, Mary's grandpa, was an avid Father Coughlin listener, at least for a while. We also had some hard left Irish Americans here in Minnesota. This guy, Vincent Dunn, whose parents were from County Kerry, was a big leader in the Teamsters. And here he is being led around by the authorities in 1934. So just to say that the Irish were involved all over the political spectrum, just like they are today. And this is another interesting one to bring up. I thought he was his grandpa, but it's actually the grand uncle of Tom Dayhill, that's active here in town, who was also named Thomas Dayhill. It's Tom's namesake. And he was chief of police in St. Paul from 1932 to 1934, which spans the period where liquor was legalized. So prohibition was repealed, I think, in December of 33. So there are all these things in the newspaper, like kind of, it's also kind of some funny parallels today with maybe with like marijuana stuff, because like it was all the people that had been selling liquor illegally that were then selling it legally, and people were like, "Is this okay?" And well, it's legal now. And he was also chief of police when Dillinger was confronted in a St. Paul apartment building and shot his way out. So that was Tom Dale's great uncle. But we're generally not going to talk about any of those people directly because they weren't dancing or singing or doing cultural activities, and I needed to limit it down somehow. So dance halls were a big thing here. Like I was talking about the Twin City Irish American Club and the people in St. Paul going out on river boats and having dances. They were going strong here. They were going strong in New York, Boston, other Irish American cities, and they went into decline during the 30s for obvious kind of financial reasons. For people didn't have money to go out dancing. And there's a great book about Irish music history in Boston that I'd recommend called "See You at the Hall," and it talks about a lot of the music moving out of the halls in the 30s and into people's houses. So that's just a little scan from one of the pages of that book, showing people dancing and playing fiddle in somebody's house, having they call it, at least in Boston, a kitchen racket. The same thing, we had Richie Piggott here talking about the history of Irish music in Chicago yesterday. He was saying much the same thing happened in Chicago. A lot of things moved into people's homes. But then the other thing that was going on in the 30s were kind of efforts to bring sort of a multicultural entertainment out to people. And this had been going on in the record industry for a long time, like race records or records like representing different ethnic groups, music. But there were these festivals. Well, I mean, even back to the World's Fair in the 1890s, there were festivals where you would have like kind of like different nations represented at the festival, doing some version of traditional art or traditional music from that country. So in Chicago, they had the World's Fair in 1933 and 1934, and it was a big deal for the Irish musicians there because it was a gig. And so a lot of relationships were made around the people that played in the band at the World's Fair those years. And there's some interesting parallels with all these things with what was going on in Minnesota. So that's the background. Now we're going to talk about the story behind the photo. I had this photo on the wall. I put it in the room today, but it was at the wall at the top of the stairway. So every day I walked up the stairs for the last year. It's been driving me insane trying to figure out who are the people in the photo. And the one thing I knew about it was that it was from the Festival of Nations. The Moran family said it was a photo taken of a group that performed at the Festival of Nations. And I was able to track down actual programs for the first two Festival of Nations. I have them here, and really, if you can hang out afterward, you want to look at them. Those that are here in person, they're fun to page through. The 1936 one has quite a few photos in it, which is great. But the Festival of Nations was started by the International Institute here in St. Paul by this woman, Alice Sickles. And it was, originally it wasn't called the Festival of Nations. They had four different, or actually just three things that they called folk festivals in 32, 33, and 34. But the idea, I like how she phrased it, we invited the people to bring to the folk festival the songs and dances they were enjoying in the privacy of their own foreign halls and churches, which really describes kind of what was going on in the Irish community largely, entertainment by the Irish for the Irish. And then this was this opportunity to bring it out and bring it to a larger part of Minnesota. And it was a real mission-driven kind of festival. She had all these she put out a book, really interesting book that's kind of rare, but you can get it from the library. Not our library, but from the St. Paul Library. Around the World in St. Paul, about kind of the philosophy behind the early Festival of Nations. And she talks about the International Institute having this mission to restore a normal way of life to transplanted people and to blend the best elements and the cultures of their homelands into a truly American culture. She had this vision of this kind of pluralist vision of America being a mosaic of people from many lands. And she talks about a two-way type of Americanization which she says is the only effective kind, where the re-education of old stock Americans is as necessary as teaching American ways to the aliens. So I love that idea. Like just as important as like these new people like understanding America. If they're going to move here, we have to make Americans like understand them. You know, it's cool idea. That was the festival was founded by. So they had their first one in 32. It was just called the Folk Festival, and she talks about in the book they didn't have an Irish booth, and it was because she just had this kind of like, oh, anybody, I'll put an ad in the paper, and any nationality that signs up, they can have a booth, and the Irish didn't sign up, and then but then the Irish came to the event and complained that they didn't that they didn't have a booth. So she was confronted by a local proud Irish woman that told her it was absolutely ridiculous that they had this festival in St. Paul and there's no Irish, which it was because Irish people have been a big part of St. Paul history. So she made a better effort after that, and when they had the first event that was officially called the Festival of Nations, because I have this program now, we can kind of get a feel for how Ireland was represented at the first festival. So it was kind of represented in two different ways. She had kind of like what the Ladies Auxiliary of the Ancient Order of Hibernians kind of idea was. They kind of had an input into it. And then there was this, what I kind of see as kind of like a separate idea that related to some of the people in that photo. But the Ladies Auxiliary of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, it's such a big mouthful. But they organized this choral group to come perform at the event, directed by Abby Milner, who was really active in the Ladies Auxiliary for a long time. There's a picture of her, and there's another picture of her choral group. She sang and played at events for the Ladies Auxiliary from the 20s all the way to the 40s. She was born and raised in St. Paul. Don't know that much about her ethnic background. She must have had connections to Ireland, one would think. She was organist and choir director just down the road at St. Columba Church in Hamlin Midway, so right in our neighborhood. But, she was kind of associated with the Ladies Auxiliary, and maybe to just try to understand what the Ladies Auxiliary and what the AOH of that era was like, I decided to try to learn a little bit about a couple of the leaders. So Anna K. Bryant was actually national president of the Ladies Auxiliary in the early to mid 30s, and this guy, Michael Dillon, was president of, I think, Division Number 1 in Minneapolis in 1935. So around the time that they were organizing the choral women to come sing. Anna Kelly Bryant was born in Iowa to Irish parents, and she married a real well-to-do fellow and lived in Minneapolis. They had a servant in their home. They lived right by what was then Lake Calhoun, Benay-McCoska there in the third ward, basically that area that had the social club that I mentioned earlier, and was active in the Twin Cities Irish American Club in the 20s, and first national president of Ladies Auxiliary to come out of Minnesota. And I thought it was interesting, she was also later really active in a group called the National Conference of Christians and Jews, kind of like an interfaith group in Minneapolis. So I don't have a lot of extra information on her, but just to give you a little bit of kind of a background. This guy ended up being a lot easier to research because he became quite a prominent Minneapolis person. He became Hennepin County Attorney and then district judge from Hennepin County for a brief time before he passed away in the 50s. But he's really kind of a fascinating guy. Michael Dillon from County Kerry, not positive where in Kerry, possibly Tralee. I found this picture of a dance on a crossroads. You can see the fiddler over there in the earth, like around 1900. So he was born in 1895. So you can imagine maybe this was the kind of scene that he was around when he was a little kid, and he was dancing when he was a little kid. And we know that because when he got here in the 19-teens, the Irish newspaper, the local Irish newspaper, which we had at the time, the Irish Standard, printed his fesh resume for all the feshiana that he had won in the 19-teens. So he got first prize in 1912 in the jig, reel, and hornpipe competition, and second prize in the Blackbird at the Stole, and first prize in the jig, reel, hornpipe, and Blackbird in Tralee in in that same year, and then he was an adjudicator in 1913. He also won another fesh that year in a number of different competitions. So he was quite a dancer, and he was publicizing his accolades and his address because he was trying to get gigs when he first came over. Basically, he did a bit of dancing then around for various like Catholic groups around town. But I found some archival footage of a fesh in Dublin in 1929. It has no sound, but I thought it would just be interesting to watch a little bit of this to imagine him competing in this kind of thing in those years. I don't know if anybody's seen this before. Have you seen this, Danielle? This one? With the two, it's interesting to see the different fiddlers cycle through in the background. But they're outdoor, kind of the same as the other picture there from Antrim on a raised stage. Doing their steps. Oh, and the adjudicators are out there, mostly not paying attention. But I'm hoping my friend Danielle Enblom can maybe help track down Michael Dillon if he's findable in the fesh archives of that era. I did find this online from the Irish Traditional Music Archive in Dublin, a program from a Munster fesh in Cork from his era, a little before when he was winning the feshes in 1912. But it does have a Dillon from Tralee in there, John or Sean. So maybe a relative. There could be something there. Could be something. We'll keep looking. When he got to Minnesota, he worked for the railroad. He taught at Jordan School, which is in northeast Minneapolis, and then he became an attorney. He went to night school while he was teaching at Jordan, and he was active in the Democratic Party. He ran unsuccessfully for Ilhan Omar's seat in 1936, and he then was successful in getting elected to be Hennepin County Attorney in 1943, and became district judge in 1955, and then died kind of before his time in 1957. But he was involved in all these different clubs: Twin Cities Irish Merit Club, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, he was president in 1935. Loyal Sons of Erin, Friendly Sons of St. Patrick, and the Robert Emmet Literary Society, which he co-founded with the father of somebody that's here today, right? That's right. So I'll get to that in 1 second. Just going to take a slight detour to the Loyal Sons of Erin, who are described in the newspaper as the high-toned Irish. So anyway, you get the idea that at least, I don't know if this would characterize all the Hibernians of the 1920s, but certainly the 1920s and 30s. But Michael Dillon and Anna K. Bryant were kind of high-class people, we'll say, So they had this other group, the Loyal Sons of Erin, that had a big party at the Minnesota Club, a formal stag in 1931. Even the farmer labor Scandinavian governor Olson was invited as an honored guest. The current belief is his ancestry is more Scandinavian than Hibernian, but for the evening he probably will be known as Seamus McOlson, the old Irish name. And I thought it was interesting. So this was 31 before Prohibition was repealed, and they kind of make a joke in the article that they're going to be drinking Hennessy -3 stars. Because Hennessy 3-star was the regular Hennessy, but they're not able to have alcohol. Yeah, at least they're not able to talk about it in the newspaper. So they also, or Dillon was involved, or he knew De Valera directly. De Valera came over in 1930 and addressed the Irish American Club, and then Dillon. This is how during the Depression, at the height of the Depression, he was able to go over to Ireland and go on this tour and hang out with De Valera. So he wasn't suffering too bad for funds as other people were. But he did this interesting tour of Ireland and Europe. And there are jokes then later referring, like if people go to Ireland, they'll say in the newspaper, like, tell De Valera that Mike Dillon says hi. So, I don't know how well he really knew him, but he claimed that he knew him anyway. So he was involved in starting this group called the Robert Emmet Society, and he was good friends with Robert Emmet O'Donnell, whose son's here today, Mike. Thanks for coming, Mike. And this other guy, Armitage, who was a kind of an earlier generation Irish immigrant. Where was Robert Emmett from? What was he? He was an immigrant himself.
Robert Emmett.
Robert, yeah.
You mean the Patriot?
No, the Robert Emmett O'Donnell. Sorry.
Robert Emmett O'Donnell. He was born here.
Oh, he was born
But
here.
his father Patrick was an immigrant.
Okay,
His
his
mother, my father.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So he was very. Robert O'Donnell was involved in the Hibernians and was the leader of the Hibernians for a lot of this time period as well. Very passionate about his namesake, Robert Emmett. And this, here in this photo, they're looking at a flag that they sort of claimed was Robert Emmett's battle flag. I don't think that tricolor was actually in use at the time of Robert Emmett, but they needed a relic for 1935. They successfully got a more substantial relic a few years later when this is a crazy story now, and I know, so Mike's here, so have to correct me if I get parts of it wrong. And there's varying reports in the newspaper, varying versions of the story, but there was this statue, there's multiple statues of Robert Emmett. There's one, I think, in California, one in DC, and then there's this one that was made specifically for Emmetsburg, Iowa. And Michael Dillon and Robert O'Donnell and Armitage, or I don't know if Armitage was involved, but the two guys, Dillon and O'Donnell, they had this desire to acquire this statue, and they heard that the Hibernians and Emmetsburg had a fight over where it was going to go or who was going to pay to put it up, and so it was sitting in a guy's basement, and they talked the guy into selling it to them. And there's varying reports on how it all went down, but they drove to Emmetsburg. One says they drove back the same night that the War of the Worlds broadcast was on the radio, and they're like, they've got this giant, like 2,000-pound statue in the back of the car, and they're driving it, you know, and Orson Welles says the world is ending, and they're driving across northern Iowa with the contraband. But it went to Robert O'Donnell's garden on Lake Minnetonka, right? Lake Minnetonka, where it stood, and Mike, who's here today, could tell you stories about it. Apparently, it was good for a snowball fight.
Tomatoes, strawberries,
Tomatoes,
cigarettes in the summer of air.
But after all, years of some degree of indignity, the people of Emmetsburg, Iowa, came in the night in 1958, and it wasn't long after your father passed away, right? They came in. They
came with a crane. In the silence of the, we have a big property. They came in the middle of the night, and next morning the door was not there.
They honestly came in the night, and when Mike woke up, the statue was gone.
The statue was discovered the next day. The FBI got involved. Well, the sheriff was Ed Ryan. The county attorney is Michael Dillon. And my father was justice of the peace for Western Hennepin County.
Yeah, that's
a good Irish group. Anyway, they all flew down to Emmetsburg, and when they got there, it was not in the park like it is today, but it was just on Main Street, and they poured like a half a ton of concrete over the lanes and the base and everything. It couldn't be moved forever, you know. And negotiations started.
I hope the people on the webinar heard that. That's amazing. So it's so he's back in Emmetsburg, Iowa, and the Baru pipe band goes down there, I guess. So you've met him a few times. You get your picture taken by you. Jim sent me a picture of the pipe band. So it was hilarious. I did all that research, and then I went in the library the same day that I did the research, and there was Mike and his son, and we'd never met each other before, so we had it was amazing.
Brian, I have to tell it. I walked in Tuesday night.
Yeah.
Introduced myself. You know, I'm not shy.
Yeah.
And Brian is sitting at his computer, and he turns the computer to me. He said, "Are you any relation to this guy O'Donnell on my computer?"
Yeah.
I said, "Brian, it's my father." And Dylan was my godfather.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's so amazing.
Incredible.
It's fantastic. I mean, it's the beauty of doing this kind of research. I just love it, Mike. Thanks so much for coming today too. So so back to this photo. So just, you know, that was kind of the Hibernian side of it. And, I mean, you can imagine people that were able to fly back and forth to Ireland and maybe had more means. They wouldn't have been at the kitchen rackets, perhaps. They wouldn't have known about whatever was going on with the fiddle, and they maybe would have been more likely to have a choral group come to perform at the Festival of Nations. But I think this group here, though a lot of these people did perform at Hibernian events, maybe they kind of represent a little different side of things. maybe more of a St. Paul side too. You know, a lot of the people I think in this photo were more St. Paul based. So we're gonna figure out who 5 of them are anyway. There's 3 unknowns, but we're gonna zoom in on these 5 now here with the rest of the talk. And of course, my favorite story is the one in the middle because he's got the fiddle. But the guy on the left, John Malone, was involved in the early days of the post-war Twin City Irish American Club. Like I said earlier, he's related to Mark Malone, that's still active in town. Mark married Sis McDonough's sister, so they're really, the families are really intertwined, especially at this stage here in St. Paul. But there's that's the guy on the left, John Malone, dancing there at one of the early dances in the post-war group. Sis McDonough and her cousin Ronnie, as the family called her, so Veronica Goodman and Margaret McDonough, they were very involved in the Festival of Nations, I think even through the 40s and maybe into the 50s. They're in this photo. I think they're probably it's definitely Sis is the third from the left sitting down, and I think it's Ronnie to her right. I don't know who else is in this. This is the only other photo I have that the Morans had from the 30s. And this is at the Festival of Nations. So there's the people from the other national groups there. You get a feel for it. But the McDonoughs were involved for a long time, and a big family here in St. Paul. Margaret's dad, Patrick McDonough, was born in Carrow, County Galway. And I don't know his whole story when he came over, but he spoke Irish and had a big family. They lived over there between here and St. Mark's in a house that was demolished for the freeway when the freeway came through. And that's them dancing at an it says an International Institute event, so it maybe wasn't the Festival of Nations. The Institute had other events, and there was an Irish group. And Ronnie's mom, so Veronica Goodman's mom, was a McDonough. So that's how that was the connection. Her name was Mary McDonough. She was Patrick's sister, so she would also been from Carrow, and she married a guy from Iceland. It was really confusing at first on the census documents. I just Ireland. And you're like, wait, that's a C. But even plus, it's a tip-off that his name was Haldor. But she married Haldor Goodman from Iceland, and Ronnie was their daughter. They're very involved in Festival of Nations for a long time. The next guy, skipping over, the photo's over there for those that are in the room. So he's the second from the right in that photo, and he's Edward Lenihan. I mentioned him earlier, a hell of a character, and Marty McHugh remembers him pretty well. He was around through the 60s, and seems like just kind of a goofball. He had this getup that he said he got in Belfast in 1910 when he was 10 years old. It's amazing he's still fit. He said he wore it his whole life, and he lived in Cathedral Hill area. He was the engineer at the Griggs Midway building, which is just right around the corner over at Fairview University. Didn't drink or smoke, played the Irish war pipes, and he called them the war pipes, so the loud bagpipes. And he's played a lot for various Catholic organizations, the Catholic Big Sisters, the Ascension Club over in Minneapolis in the 20s. And then he got pretty involved, well, at least as a musician, and dancer at AOH events and the Shamrock Club at St. Paul. So the last one here, and we'll finish probably another half hour or so on Mike Sullivan, because he's just absolutely fascinating, and there are a lot of good threads and places to go with his story. So Mike Sullivan is the guy in the photo. I now am confident in saying. And he was born in 1881 in Cork, possibly. I'm in touch with his granddaughter. She thought maybe Cork, but we haven't totally confirmed that yet. And he came as a 3-year-old to New York City, came through Ellis Island, and he was there all through his childhood. So he married his wife out there in 1902, had 2 daughters in New York, came to St. Paul in 1914, had 3 more daughters here, 5 daughters in total, and they lived in Frogtown first at 703 Western, and then moved over to 776 Ashland, which is kind of, I don't know if that would be considered Rondo or more like Summit. It's kind of in between the 2 blocks west of Sweeney's, that. He was a mail carrier for his entire working life here in St. Paul, And Martin, like I said, Martin McHugh remembered him and said, there was a fine fiddle player here. So it's fascinating that he lived in New York for that time period, that he came to New York in 1884 and was there until 1914. Of course, New York, Irish music in New York was recorded quite a bit in the 20s and 30s. And there are all these famous musicians that were connected to the New York scene. So you have to wonder if you knew any of these people. The most famous fiddle player, which appears in this group photo from 1916, Michael Coleman, I think came right after Mike Sullivan left. So that they were ships passing in the night. If Mike Sullivan was even hanging out in these kind of circles, we don't really know. We don't know if he knew the kind of, the heads of the New York Irish music scene, or if he just played privately, or what his involvement was. I mean, he came over when he was 3 years old, so he didn't learn to play the fiddle in Ireland. We could assume. You would have grown up learning how to play in New York. And he definitely knew how to play by the time he came to Minnesota, because I'm pretty sure this has to be him in 1917, not too long after he came, playing at a benefit for the new Hibernian Hall, which I think was a venue for the AOH here in St. Paul. It says Olenshaw's Orchestra. Again, this kind of two separate bands, one for modern music, one for old-fashioned music, which they were already making that distinction in the 19-teens. Olenshaw's Orchestra will furnish the music at Hall Number 1, and Sullivan's Orchestra, which will include Irish bagpipes, will furnish the fun for the square and step dancing. So a lot of fascinating things about that. One is that it mentions square dancing, and that there's going to be Irish bagpipes playing for the square dancing, and square dancing and step dancing kind of mentioned in one breath there. It's interesting, and that was going on in the 50s with Irish American Club here. They had square dances, they do the Siege of Venice, they do a foxtrot and a bunny hop, and then they have square dance, and then they do like the Siege of Venice again, and then waltzes and stuff. It's kind of an interesting hodgepodge. And so that was good. That kind of mix was going on in the 19-teens. You can find Mike Sullivan and the many women of his family in the census documentation there at 703 Western in Frogtown, where he was already working as a postman. I found this cool photo from the Minnesota Historical Society of one of the schools in that neighborhood. It's right where there's like a community center and a baseball diamond there now. I used to live in the artist co-op that's across the street from that now. So he was over there in Frogtown with a lot of women, including his sister-in-law, Catherine McDonald. So kind of implies that maybe Mary was a McDonald. And then comes Henry Ford. So we don't know a lot about what Mike Sullivan was up to, though I haven't spent all the hard hours at the microfilm over at the Minnesota Historical Society trying to trace him through the 20s on the St. Paul newspapers. But in 1925, there was this famous national story. Remember the kind of Elon Musk comparison. So everybody was following everything that Henry Ford ate for breakfast. And he was into old fiddle tunes, and he was into square dancing. And he actually published a book trying to revive square dancing and get Americans doing the good old-fashioned square dancing. It has a little bit of a vibe of, and not dancing to jazz, and not being an immoral flapper, you gotta rein it in and get back to the old days. And around that time, there was this widely publicized story, and I can't remember the details, you can read about it online, of this fiddle player in Maine who had won a fiddle contest, and then he was brought to Dearborn, Michigan to be like Henry Ford's special private old man fiddle player. And he brought him there, and of course, it was widely reported, and he produces the actual Stradivarius, and then the old guy plays Turkey the Straw in the Stradivarius. But it was this like a media phenomenon. Like it was in all the newspapers, and to the point that like Melly Dunham is just mentioned. Like everybody knows who Melly Dunham. He's Henry Ford, or somehow Ford had this nickname, the Flivver King. Elon's got to get a cool nickname like that. He invited him to his mansion, and it inspired fiddle contests immediately. So that happened at the end of 1925, and then there was this huge outbreak of fiddle contests, at least around the upper Midwest. And a lot of people that do research on this era find these fiddle contests. There's a lot of information because they dredged up all these old fiddle players from all around the region. And even though Henry Ford had this maybe kind of like prescribed, maybe kind of tight idea of what old music was and what old time music should be, the people that showed up at the contests were from all over the shop. You know, it's kind of wonderful. And there were even some women that entered the contest. There were certainly people from a lot of different nationalities. So it gives you kind of a little bit of an idea of what was out there. Because the Minneapolis newspapers are digitized, you can read pretty easily about they had all these like preliminary rounds at the end of January 1926, and people trying to, you know, make it to the finals. There's a few of these guys that are really interesting that I know a bit about. Jim O'Donnell was from Shieldsville, an interesting early Irish community here in Minnesota down by Northfield. And he actually played for some AOH stuff and Shamrock Club events into the 40s. Must have been a great fiddle player himself, or at least entertaining. He didn't make it very far in the contest. Neither did Albert Hanna, who was from the Ottawa Valley and lived for a long time in Bemidji, where I'm from, and was a singer. So he was collected from in Bemidji in 1923 by a folk song collector named Franz Rickety that went up there and transcribed this. He didn't record him, but he transcribed his song. Didn't say anything about him playing the fiddle. But Albert came down here and lived in Minneapolis and entered the fiddle contest. Ole Hendricks also entered the same contest, and there's a whole book that's been written by him by our friend Amy Shaw here in town. He was a Scandinavian, is it Norwegian? I'm gonna probably screw it up, Norwegian or Swedish. But he lived up by the Red River Valley and made his way down here to enter. None of those guys won. The contest in Minneapolis was won by Carl Old King Touch Schwanenberg, and they listed what he played. Interestingly, Where the River Shannon Flows, which is like an Irish music hall song, Dixie, Ach du lieber Augustine, Arkansas Traveler, Where Oh Where Has My Little Dog Gone, and Sweet Bunch of Daisies. So they weren't exactly looking for the Bucks of Oranmore at the Minneapolis contest. Anyway, so this is the Minneapolis contest, and it says, you know, he won $100, and he was supposed to get to go on this tour. The contest was published by Daily News and Finkelstein and Rubin, which is like a newspaper conglomerate of some sort. And they were going to bring him on this tour. They don't say much about the tour. Then last week, I got in the mail from Mike Sullivan's granddaughter this clipping, which is so exciting. So Mike Sullivan won the St. Paul contest in 1926. And the article's over there. If you're interested, you should really read the whole thing. I posted it up on the McKiernan Library Facebook page too. But so he was quite a bit younger than all those other guys. He wasn't like, you know, what Henry Ford was looking for, like the crusty old fiddler pulled out of the woods. He was about in his mid 40s, I suppose. At 26, he was born in 83. Do the math. yeah, 43, I guess. So that's a great age, same as me. And he won, it said, a diamond medal, whatever that is. And it said again, this 10 weeks long tour with the King Cole Review, and there would be fiddling contests at each town that he'd be brought to. This was published in the St. Paul Daily Globe, which I assume was owned by the people that did the contest. So their article doesn't say what he played, unfortunately, but it says like how happy he is that he won, how like he's just so overjoyed. Because they were putting up the money to pay, so they wanted it to seem like this, like a heartwarming thing about this guy. So delighted that he won the contest. So he's going to go on this tour. Starts in Minneapolis, goes to St. Paul, Brainerd, St. Cloud, Austin, Rochester, Winona, Mankato, Eau Claire, Duluth, Virginia, Hibbing, Mandan, and beautiful Mitchell, South Dakota. And when all that's over, Mr. Sullivan is going to New York, back where I used to live, as he said to the reporter, to make phonograph records for Perfect. Is the spelling incorrect? Is it Perfect Records? Don't know. Under arrangement made by Harry Bernstein. I have some theories about the record, and this gentleman here today might have some theories too. We're going to be looking into this record. Anyway, it's very exciting, the idea that he might have been recorded. And his granddaughter, when I first talked to her, she said, you know, I think he was recorded. So it's very exciting. Yeah. Very exciting. Anyway, so she also sent me this. It must be from around the same time. He went, there was a famous boxer in the Twin Cities at the time. who was also a Sullivan. He went by, his name was Myron, but he went by My Sullivan. And they're shaking hands there, the two champions, before he goes up, supposedly on his tour. Now, I can't wait to do more research on the tour. The next year, though, we're going to leave the contest. We're going to go to 27. He is playing on the radio on WCCO with Patrick Linehan on the Irish pipes, the only set in the Northwest, which kind of guarantees. Oh, and then they describe here, the Irish pipes look and sound very much like the Scotch bagpipes, but the Irish at least insist that there is a great difference between the two types. Well, there is indeed a great difference between the two sets of instruments. And Tom Dayhill, grandnephew of the chief of police, Tom Dayhill actually has PJ Linehan's uilleann pipes here and plays them, which is amazing. And they're inscribed inside the box. If you ask Tom for the story how he got them, it's quite a story. But then they say PJ Linehan Reedmaker inside the box. So that clearly has to be the same guy. They're playing with Michael Sullivan and his daughter Catherine Sullivan on piano on the radio. Amazing. In 1929 and 30, the local post office organized a band with kind of like a orchestral conductor, local conductor. So they were playing like classical music, but as part of that, you know, maybe because they had a diamond medal winning fiddle champion in their ranks, Mike Sullivan would get up during the program and play tunes. And the one thing says, you know, he would play a group of Irish jigs and reels on the old time fiddle. So it's interesting they're using the word old time there, but you know, we use that word to distinguish between Irish music and American music now, but could mean totally something really different, or it could just mean old music. My take on it just means old music, and there's no like ethnic distinction really to the term. He also had a dance band. Now there was a little hint at that in that really early 1917 article of Sullivan's dance band or Sullivan's orchestra playing for an event. But these are all listings for St. Patrick's Day entertainment, either organized by the Shamrock Club or happening at the St. Paul Coliseum, which was at University of Lexington. It's a huge place. Kurt, that's here today, knows more about it than I do. Was it always attached to the stadium, or was the stadium put there after the Coliseum was there?
When they tore down the old stadium, they decided to make that corner into like a what do you call it? A big, entertainment complex.
Okay, yeah.
With a dance hall
and that's when the Coliseum was there, but it was like the entertainment complex corner.
Yeah.
So the Twin Cities Shamrock Club had Mike Sullivan playing in 1928 there at the Knights of Columbus Hall. And the next year in 29, you see this article for a big state. Now, and so the Knights of Columbus thing could have still been going on in 29. I'm not sure, like if I'm chronologizing. Whoa, it's not a word. Anyway, I'm putting these in order, and the first one, there could be separate events really, but the Shamrock Club has a thing with the Knights of Columbus in 28. In 29, there's definitely a St. Patrick's Day party. It definitely features this guy that Frank Cotier, or Cotier, how would you pronounce it?
It's Cloutier, but
Cloutier.
It's often misspelled.
Yeah, so sometimes it's Cloutier with an L, and then it's lost the L here, and it's Coutier, piano player and director of the St. Paul Coliseum Orchestra, and you can have your green paper hats and your Irish souvenirs to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. In 1930, it doesn't list the music, but there's a St. Patrick's Day dance again at the Coliseum, more paper hats, Irish confetti that year, and a hot dance program, regular prices. So you can see the depression hitting there. Like, we didn't change our prices. Maybe that's what that means. And then the next one, 31, St. Patrick's Day dance, green paper hats and streamers, and Frank Cotier's wonderful dance music. So he's lost the U out of his name there. And then in 1932, height of the Depression again. And, again, like we're imagining Irish music maybe has gone underground. There's no big events. Here's what seems like a huge event of Irish music with Frank Cotier's Coliseum Orchestra and Irish music by Mike Sullivan's Champions. So there's Mike Sullivan definitely involved, and the Twin Cities Shamrock Club listed as the kind of sponsoring organization, a step dancing contest, tickets at the door, public invited, free parking space for 2,000 cars. Welcome to Minnesota. And 1933, the Shamrock Club is still at the St. Paul Coliseum. Not much information in that little city brief. I didn't find anything from 34. From 35, the Coliseum event is still going. There's no mention of the Shamrock Club or Mike Sullivan. This is a photo of John Lane's Coliseum Pavilion. You can see, perhaps that's the parking. Maybe you didn't want to have to leave in a hurry. But it's an amazing photo, incredible. And I can't remember. There's a date on that. I can't remember if you know Kurt this day, but I can't remember what it is. It's around that time. Anyway, the ad there with the 2000, and John Lane was an Irish Minnesotan as well. I can't remember if he was an immigrant himself, or was he an immigrant himself? It'd be fun to know more about him as the host. So this is Frank, we think, Cloutier, or Coutier, or Coutier, or however you spell his name, and his orchestra. And Kurt, that's here today, has done a load of wonderful research on this group, because they had a recording included in the famous Harry Smith folk anthology that came out. And they're kind of the only recording from this far north, right? Or from certainly from.
Yeah, basically the only recording that's not from the South.
Right. Is this one recording that was included, really influential and like kind of inspirational to the folk revival anthology that was put out. And I thought I would play. This is the track that was included in the anthology. So this is these guys that would have been playing opposite Mike Sullivan. Recorded a few years earlier when they were the resident band at a different cafe, the Victoria Cafe, same neighborhood sort of, or kind of more towards Frogtown. The instrumentalists might be different people than in the photo, but you get the drift basically of what the kind of music would be. And they play this kind of crazy medley with a lot of shouting. And the first tune is a recognizable Irish music hall song that the band even recorded. So you might recognize the first one. They don't spend very long on it though.
Hey, Mr. Larson, it's Mikey. We are trying to order a respectable place here. Let her go, boys.
You can get an idea that they would have been able to play, certainly for an Irish crowd, and probably had a few tunes that would work, for a siege event or something like that, Fascinating recording and just amazing. Thanks, Kurt, for all the work you did on that. It was awesome to find your site and find all that information right there. So Prohibition was repealed in December of 33, and already by March of 34, the Irish imagery was being used to sell booze. And this is I just thought I'd put that ad up to, because you couldn't have had an ad like that before 1934. And then all of a sudden, the floodgates opened again, and the Shamrocks were selling the whiskey and all that kind of thing. In 35, St. Patrick's Day fell on a Sunday, which caused great consternation for some of the Catholic organizations that wanted to celebrate it. But they had the AOH had a party on Saturday. The Ladies Auxiliary had a Sunday afternoon program. You kind of get the idea that the Shamrock Club was not involved with what was going on at the Coliseum by this point, because the AOH in the top little bit there, it says an invitation has been extended to members and friends of the Twin Cities Shamrock Club, and it has kind of a sound to me like maybe like they didn't have anywhere else to go, and maybe they had fallen from the heights of 2,000 cars worth of parking and needed another organization to step in. I think it's kind of interesting. You see a parallel there with the ancient Hibernians by sticking around so steadily through the history of Irish culture in the Twin Cities, that even like when the Irish Fair kind of couldn't get it together there for a few years at the end of the 80s and the 90s, the Hibernians put on the event, like they kind of, there's something to be said for longevity, it's awesome to see like the different clubs and kind of these ones ebb and these ones flow, and then people pick up the slack for each other. Ed Linehan there is mentioned in this article in his getup that he's had since he was 10 years old, dancing, and Mike Sullivan, Irish fiddler, and the Ladies Auxiliary choral group is playing. So all these things are coming together in 35, which makes sense because this is kind of the world that was then presented at the Festival of Nations the next year. And it's interesting to see, like, let's assume that Mike Sullivan and the Shamrock Club was moved out of the Coliseum by then. Whatever orchestra, and I don't know if Cloutier was still at the Coliseum in 35 or not, but the mention here that you can request your favorite Irish tune, and if we cannot play it, you get a free ticket is interesting. So if any Mike Sullivan's friends came in and wanted the Bucks of Warrenmore, maybe they get a free ticket. That's Mike Sullivan again. I found this photo. Him playing. Now this is an ancient order of Hibernians organized event here, Division 4, an Irish step dancing contest at the Knights of Columbus Hall. And that was on Smith, right in downtown, where there's a condo development. Right across from the Excel Center is where that Knights of Columbus Hall was. And Mike Sullivan was actually a leader in sharing the event. I love the guy dancing there. He's got a great. It would be great to find the original version of it and be able to see him better. But they also paired up found another thing of those two, of him playing for the same dancer, Thomas O'Donoghue, at an event at Breezy Point on Lake Minnetonka in 1926. So they knew each other. And then Mike Sullivan had this other interesting identity as an old-time fiddler, in the sense of like olden days, as that was understood in the 30s. So in the there was and Kurt was just saying this, there was a real kind of an impulse to look back during the 20s, kind of around some of what I was saying about Henry Ford, just kind of freak out around flappers and jazz music and wanting to kind of look back. There was also kind of just maybe a more positive way to put it, was like a sense that this generation was dying out, and a lot of these people were some of the first Europeans to move to Minnesota, and these people's stories should be told, their music should be heard, and they should get to wear their fancy dresses one more time. So there were a number of there were events at the Festival of Nations, there were events at the State Fair here in St. Paul, or Falcon Heights, celebrating the pioneer generation in Minnesota, we'll say. And this is a group that was at the Festival of Nations in 39, though I wonder if this photo is actually 36, but the Minnesota U of M archives think it's 39. But that's Mike Sullivan there on the left. And the fiddle, I bet the other, in one of the programs is a fiddle player named Finnerty. And I wonder if that's him. So it could be another Irish Minnesotan fiddle player to play with him. Mike Sullivan's got his get up there with his hat. It's funny that he would be lumped in with the pioneers since he didn't. He grew up in New York City and then moved to Minnesota in 1914. But they needed a fiddle player. So there's the American program from the Festival of Nations, and you can see he's listed: Mike Sullivan fiddle, Thomas Finnerty fiddle, and Howard Lee banjo. Now there's no banjo in that photo. This is the program from 36, and that photo could be from 39. But they had, as along with all the other nations at the Festival of Nations, they had an American program. And then the State Fair had this thing, the Territorial Pioneers. I think there's still a Pioneer Hall at the State Fair, right? So that's a pioneer group. You can see a guy in the back row there with a harmonica, I think, in his mouth. But Mike Sullivan played for these things, and this lists him as old-time fiddler, caller, and accompanist. So he's accompanying the dancing, I think is what the accompanist part is, and then he must have been able to call a square dance, I suppose. It's interesting, in the 50s, there was a guy, Coleman McDonough. He was related to the McDonough family, second uncle, and he was an immigrant from Galway, and he would call, like Marty said, he was able to call square dances. So even like an immigrant like Mike Sullivan or Coleman McDonough maybe learned how to call square dances, which makes sense. That's what was cool. Mike Sullivan was still playing when the Irish American Club started in the late 40s. That's how Marty would have remembered him. And this is interesting because in the St. Paul Dispatch, there's a photo from the new Irish American Club with these three recently arrived Colleens, as it calls them, the three Maureen. They're all named Maureen. They're all named Maureen. And but then it runs an article below about the old timers. The old Shamrock Club is having their 36th annual St. Patrick's Day, featuring, again, they've got an orchestra. I think what does it say? They're gonna Joe Brabeck's College of St. Thomas Orchestra will play for modern dancing. Mike Sullivan, old-time Irish fiddler, accompanied by his daughter Anne. Pat Doherty and Mike Hughes will play for the old time as well as the modern dancing. The Irish step will be one of the dance features. And so Mike Hughes played the fiddle and grew up by Benson, Minnesota, and moved into town and was somebody that played with Marty Q for a long time. Pat Doherty's a little bit more of a mystery. And then Anne Sullivan was, so I think the previous one was Catherine Sullivan. So two of Mike Sullivan's daughters played piano with him. I'm pretty sure this is probably him too, a well-known Irish fiddler and his musical shamrocks. He used the name Mike Sullivan's Shamrocks in previous newspaper things. Reasonable guess that might have still been him playing in 1951, and then he passed away in 1954. So, to bring it full circle to the photo, this photo, the Morin family wasn't sure what year it was from. Looking at the Festival of Nations program from 36, Margaret Sis McDonough is listed there as dancing an Irish schottische, and the musicians Mike Sullivan and Ed Linehan. So those three people are in the photo. Mike McDonough, I suppose, could be the accordion player, but I think that's unlikely. It seems more likely that the photo corresponds with the 39 festival, because that's where they say there's an Irish jig played by this kind of classical musician, Donna May, and with an accompanist, and then they did an 8-hand reel, and it lists the members of the 8-hand reel, and sure enough in there is Sis McDonough, Margaret Mary, and Ronnie Goodman, and John Malone, and Ed Linehan, and then the Irish jig played by Mike Sullivan with his daughter Anne, who's now married, different last name. So the characters that are listed there in 39 are all in that photo. Well, the 5 characters that I identified in the photo are all listed there. So the feeling was probably that year, and the Festival of Nations was in April, and then in May there's this joint LA AOH event called the Irish Fesh at the Ascension Club. And the Irish 6-hand reel will be danced by Mrs. Margaret McDonough. So that's Sis, Ronnie Goodman, Helen Sullivan. I don't think she's related to Mike unless I got the name wrong. And then Kitty Coyne, that must be the same as Catherine Coyne. So that could be one of the extra women in the photo. And then Ed Linehan, John Maloney, which must be John Malone, Mike Sullivan, And then it mentions James O'Donnell. He was the bespectacled fiddle player from the fiddle contests. Jim McDonald and Ed Lenahan. So same kind of gang. And there's MJ Dillon again too, the dancer from Kerry who became the county attorney. So that was the scene in the late 30s, at least as much of it as I can kind of piece together. The obvious, hanging questions are who are the extra people or the other people in the photo, especially the accordion. I can find absolutely no mention of accordion in any newspaper stuff that I've looked at. So he's fascinating. He's got a one row there, you call a melodeon these days. And I suppose one of those women could be Kitty Coyne. She's mentioned it in the two articles. And then, of course, the other thing is, was Mike Sullivan really recorded for perfect or possibly perfect records? Well, I found this morning that Perfect Records did issue at least one 78 RPM record in 1926, the same year as the contest, of a champion winning fiddle player out in Rhode Island named Uncle Joe Shippey. There he is, looking very authentic. And he played a real kind of classic kind of fiddle contest medley of these two, Irish washerwoman, White Cockade, Marching Through Georgia, and the Virginia Reel. We'll listen to a little bit of him just to kind of close it up, and then I'll take questions. Perfect Records online. So that's it. Thanks so much. Thanks. And if anybody has any questions, ask away. Otherwise, we can just informally chat too. And I don't know, Natalie's running the webinar, so if any of our online listeners have any questions, Natalie will have to come in and tell me. So, see you.
Brian, is this part of an ongoing research by you?
It is, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just settled into kind of a pattern of me doing one of these every year. So 2 years ago, I did a bunch of work on a fiddler that also won a fiddle contest in the 20s, Tony Doherty, who was from Scott County, south of town, and then moved up to St. Paul. Did that then, and then last year I did the one on the Irish American Club, the post-war Irish American Club, and then this one. So just have to see what comes next. There's a lot of directions to go, not just back in time either. Because one thing I'm really interested in is like the outstate communities, like all these funny little farm communities, like the Malones and the Morans lived down in Curry, Minnesota, way down in the kind of southwestern corner of the state for a while. And then that guy Mike Hughes lived in Benson and the Shieldsville. There's
all those little Irish towns.
Green Isle, yeah, all the ones. A lot of them were started by the bishop, by John Ireland.
James J. Hill and
James, yeah, in cahoots with one another.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. If you were interested, I'm from St. Paul, but I've been away for 60 years.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of interested in looking into my Irish ancestry. Where would you recommend that I start?
Well, there's the Irish Genealogical Society has a library and people that are knowledgeable about.
Where's that
started. They're in the Minnesota Genealogical Society building in Mendota Heights, and then we have resources here too, but it wouldn't be like our overarching focus. So I always mention the other.
How about the Hill Library? I started down there a long time ago, and I never really.
Yeah, I mean these days there's so much you can do online, and I mean if you'd like to come in here,
Yeah,
I know how to do a lot of the online stuff
Oh, okay.
that one can
Yeah,
do. I'd be
yeah.
happy to sit down with you. And another one of our volunteers, Tim Scanlon, he's on the board at the Irish Genealogical Society. He comes in here often so he would be able to help you as well. So we'd love to help out.
And I think the Hill Library has closed, has it?
Yeah. it's no
Oh,
longer-
I don't know. Yeah.
Hill Library is no longer,
Yeah.
the Hill Library is no longer around. It's closed.
Oh, that's right.
But yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to be a resource here. Like,
Okay.
you know, I've done quite a bit of
All
that
right,
kind of
thanks,
research.
But Brian, I want to mention, I think that the repository of so much geological is the Gale Library at the Historical Society.
In Wisconsin.
In here.
Oh, here. Oh, sorry. No one here. Yeah, sorry.
You know,
It could be
the
the
finest
Mills
stuff.
Library.
It has the finest collection of state newspapers of any.
Oh no, it's amazing. Yeah, the Minnesota Historical Society. And my favorite thing is the newspaper research because it's so rich. And you might think, like, if you look at today's newspapers, you might think, well, what am I going to learn looking at newspapers? But it's not anything like what they used to be. Like, you used to report on everybody's business. Like, you know, like Jim Tarbox went over and had a cup of coffee and he said it was too hot. You know, like the detail you can find at MNHS in the newspaper is just amazing. And then some of them have been digitized too, depending on what you're looking for. Like, if you're looking at the older you're looking, the more stuff's online, and to some extent with newspapers. You know, somebody asked, was the program recorded to be accessed online? Yes, it was. Hopefully that all worked. As long as it all worked, this program will be up online for people that want to view it later. Yeah.
Can I ask a little question? You have Pat Doherty, a fiddle player there. Do you think, is there any connection with Tony, or can you?
I don't think there's any connection with Tony. There were two Doherty. I think it's, of course it's too bad that Marty's not around, because I think Marty knew the Pat Doherty. Nobody, see, I spent all that time, which was really wonderful, and it ended up being a great project with Tony Doherty, I think 2 years ago. And then I went and I met all these people from Marty's generation, and they were like, who are you talking to? We never met Tony Doherty. Because he was from rural Minnesota, and he came in, he was only here very briefly, and he played a little bit around town, but nobody really met him or remembered it from Marty's generation. Pat Doherty, I think, is different. I think he's a different Doherty family. I think they were around for longer, and Marty had stories about some of that. So I think and then it's confusing to me whether he played music or not. That newspaper thing kind of indicates that he maybe did. And I know, like, when Marty got here in '49, he borrowed an accordion from someone, like, right away. So, like, there were definitely accordions around. So I don't know. And there's a couple mentions of flute in the early stuff, and a couple interesting mentions of harp, which I'm not sure what to make of the harp ones. I talked to Ann Heyman about that, and I'll try to understand what that might have been. But yeah.
In Victor Green's Passion for Polka, I think that I didn't prepare for this, but I think he says that the Twin Cities were important for like a dance music in the like the WPA era, like the development of a revival of interest in dance music. And I think he cites Alice Sickles Around the World in St. Paul.
Oh, okay.
So I've always wanted to know, like, that just mythology, or do you know about that? Do I need to go to Washington?
Yeah. Yeah, I found a few things in the digitized Minneapolis papers about there being a WPA orchestra around the Twin Cities. There's, if you're interested, I should, Dick Reese, that's a fiddle player that lived here for a long time and has moved up to Duluth, shared with another local researcher, Mike Sawyer, this amazing manuscript book, Handwritten Tunes, that was the tune book of the WPA orchestra in Superior, Wisconsin. And I've got a digital copy of that here, if you're interested in a few newspaper articles about the group. But they were definitely, they were funded directly by the WPA, and they were playing, this kind of funny hodgepodge of polkas and foxtrots and jigs and reels.
Brian, can you hear me? I've got a couple questions online.
Yeah, I can see him here actually. Is it the square dance one?
Yeah, from Suzanne Reese. Do you think the square dance is referred to in some of the articles might have been set dances, or some of them hybrid?
Yeah, Well, I don't know, but I think they were quite possibly, you know, American square dances, like things that would have been in Henry Ford's book, which I'm not super familiar with the square dance tradition, but they certainly could have been. And like the things that they were doing in the 50s, Marty McHugh definitely, like, he didn't think they were set dances, you know, like he thought they were like American square dances. So just kind of extrapolating that backwards makes me think that it's quite plausible that they were doing, you know, quote unquote regular American square dances. Of course, dance was all in flux too, you know, like what was, and Danielle would know things about this, but like what was Irish, like officially Irish, and what wasn't officially Irish was all changing. And set dances were like on the outs for a while, if I understand it right. They were considered like not Irish enough to be included. So it's all kind of complicated, and because the immigrants came over maybe with some of these things in mind, or maybe they came over before people were worried about that. Yeah, go ahead. No.
There were square dances all over North America being brought over through the fur trade and Scottish immigrants and Irish immigrants from you know, like way earlier than this. So there would have been a concept of square dancing and quadrilles.
There's probably more, like, I think with a lot of these terms with this era, they're probably more general than we think they are.
And you also saw like the reference to jig dancing. And in North American vernacular, to jig was to do the lively form of dancing. So it's not a 6/8 dance, it's a lively.
Necessarily, though it could have, you know.
Potentially, yeah.
Like, because like there's that one photo from the book with Ed Lenahan. There's, you know, there's definitely like this association with the Irish and jig, for sure. And like the one, like, so that means it must have an ethnic association in that. And like the one thing with the one newspaper, I forgot to mention this because I was going to sing my little bit of a song, but one of them said at the program there's going to be theatrical performances of blah 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 and the Old Irish Jig. And the Old Irish Jig was a famous like music hall song from the 1800s that was all about like a fig for your new fashion waltzes imported from Spain and from France, and a fig for the thing called the polka. The Old Irish Jig is the dance. So like that, you know, that kind of ethnic demarcation of like, we do the jig because we're Irish, and that's what the page in the book is like. There's nothing as Irish as the jig. So I don't know, like I think it could be both, you know, like I think it could be used generally, but like that's what is the most confusing, is when a term is used here generally and here to make a ethnic distinction.
We have a question from, sorry if you're ready. We have another question from Steve Wilson. The lack of digital access of the St. Paul papers is hugely frustrating. Have you heard anything regarding eventually doing that? If not, what's the best way to research the St. Paul side? My grandfather was a fairly prominent doctor. Steve Wilson.
Yes, thanks, Steve. Yeah, I mean, you go to the microfilm and bring your reading glasses and spend some time. They do have digital microfilm machines at the MNHS, though. I wish they had that kind of fancier one. So at the Wisconsin Historical Society, you just like you throw it all on the thumb drive, and it's all really pretty easy going. You can do that here too, but it's kind of got it's a little laborious. There's no way around being laborious at the moment. The St. Paul papers before, I can't remember, one of the papers before 1920 or 1910 or something has been digitized. But other than that, yeah, it's just microfilm. Glorious. But when you find something in microfilm, like I have that picture of Mike Sullivan playing for the dancing guy, that was at like 4 hours of going through microfilm and not finding anything. And I was like, okay, my time's up. I gotta go home. And it's like, oh, one more page. And there he was. But
So you should always stay for that one.
yeah. Oh man, that one more page gives you like 4 more hours. If you're really into it.
Then there's foreign language.
Oh yeah, there's foreign language papers. Yeah. There's a lot there that could be mines too, like the German papers.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Kate, and I'll get you. What's your Kate?
Well, I was really intrigued by the amalgam of clothing styles that the women were wearing and how they either tended to match what you were talking about or seemed rather discordant. And
what do you mean by match? What I was talking about? Like, well, if you
were talking about Irish X, dancers or performers, and yet they seem to be very distinctly dressed in more of a dirndl or German style of dress, as well as that one picture.
Like even that
men,
picture, like the
men were wearing lederhosen, and then I thought, and I know.
Well, that was the multi-ethnic picture.
Yeah,
like that was like all the different groups.
The last time you gave a presentation for the Derek Shockton and Welga, I spoke with one of the women who was there, and she said, well, we really didn't have much dress, and so we may have just borrowed, someone's clothing, but I thought it was, I just was trying to put pieces together, especially of the pioneer dress, and then in the middle there was this woman who was wearing something that to me seemed clearly 1920, not flapper dress, but it was clearly more upper class, in comparison. But
I suppose it's always the way, isn't it? Like we just, Danny and Danielle and Anna and I were just at a thing yesterday where it was people were coming out with their national flags or whatever, and some people had like the costumes, and then some people were just wearing like their polo shirt. There's always a guy that forgets.
The concept of Irish national dress is complicated because the Irish is so poor compared to other Western European countries. The national dress was essentially rags for hundreds of years, and that's a complicating factor. You have certain elements that like tweed, but that's really only for upper class people. But like in that picture, you've got one person who's got a kind of conventional, nationalistic kind of constructed Irish national dress. The woman who's like three from the right, in the second row with the kind of apron thing in front. But then all the others seem to have like a German style going on.
Well, a lot of these are German. This is the mix. This is like a mass group. So we know Sis is sitting on, that's Sis McDonough, and I think that's Ronnie, like the third and fourth on the bottom.
But in the picture framed here in the room, they're also dressed in the German style. The women.
Well, I'm curious because I've done
this picture,
photos and things, and so I'm always curious about when something kind of matches and something doesn't, and what was the process by which they adopted XYZ to wear. But anyway.
Well, the incredible, my folklore hero, Jim Leary, has done so much wonderful work on how the upper Midwest is like this kind of it is really a melting pot, and there are all these funny little pockets too that kind of like maintained ethnic identity in quirky ways for really long periods of time, and then there's funny hybrids. Like he has this whole concept of polkabilly, like these different things coming together, and I think you see some of that here. You see like is he an old time fiddler? Is he an Irish fiddler? Maybe that's just it. It's just because they're general words. Is he calling square dances? Is he other dances? And then you see that with the dress, and then you also see this like we need to provide both food groups for the people. We need the brass band, and then we need the celebrated Irish piper. Or maybe like this. But like we need to cover these two separate bases, like recognizing a distinction and then like providing that distinction for the people, like you like this. And it was like if you read that Boston book, she talks a lot, like they really specifically at the halls in Boston in the 50s had an upstairs big band with horns, and then like Paddy Cronin and his friends were like playing downstairs, and it was like not very many people were down there, and you were paid less, and it was less of a it was a different kind of music.
Well, sorry.
It's okay.
Well, thank God for Kim Leary, for one thing.
Yeah.
And then I would also wonder if, in Ireland a long time ago, people in one county would look at another people in another county and say, that's not Irish music.
So, yeah.
So
for sure, and it's not like it was only fiddlers at the crossroads over there too. There was some back and forth.
Well, and for instance, some of the stuff you were showing of Irish dancing and the old, like looking at old feshionette, there was a lot of discrepancy in the early 1900s around what was authentic Irish dancing.
Yeah.
And I was trying to, while you were talking, I was trying to find the PowerPoint presentations, I've got quotes from the microfiche of Clive Sullis, which was the Gaelic League periodical from like 1901. And they're talking about all that fancy Dublin dancing coming in, and, you know, and that wouldn't have been the tradition of, you know, West Cork and Kerry and all of that.
For sure.
We did get a little bit of that.
All right. Well, maybe we should let, let me see. Just checking your messages. I think that's probably it. I'll let the video end and everything wrap up. But if you want to stay and chat, please come up and look at things. If you want to look at the Festival Nations brochures or the newspaper articles. Thanks for coming, everybody.